I am going to ask each of you to tell me a little bit about your entry into the world of being an artist. So what made you make the brave decision to make your life an art? And I'm going to then ask a little bit of what was important about being a resident artist, and then a little bit about the exhibition downstairs. And I think we're gonna start with Andrea.
Okay.
If that's okay.
One question at a time, or?
Yeah, let's do the first question first. And so everyone has about 5 minutes to answer each of these questions.
It's an interesting question. I don't,
Let me check the levels. Can people in Zoom land hear when Andrea is talking? Thumbs up. Okay, good. Go ahead.
It's an interesting question you're asking, because it's not something I think about a lot, but I went to Syracuse University for undergrad, and they had a program called surface pattern design, and it's where, I guess now most folks would think of it as illustration, but people would go in and they would design textiles. And so I wanted to do that, but then I had a clay project, and it was all over, and that was my path forward. And so for this exhibition, I started feeling this, not nostalgic, but just a pull to go back into the literal repeated pattern. And so I don't think that I don't regret going into clay, but I do want to go back into whatever it was that pulled me into surface pattern design too. So so that's how I started it. I got a clay assignment, and I think my teacher said the clay bug bit.
Yeah,
it was,
people say that.
it is what it is, right?
Yeah. Well, but you were there for art to begin with.
Art history, probably.
Art history.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I get to ask what about our history did you love? People.
It was so funny. I worked at the Everson Museum of Art as an intern for a big event that they had there. It was like an anniversary. And if you haven't been to the Everson, I.M. Pei, who's a really fab, he's passed now, hasn't he? Chinese American architect, designed the building. It was his first museum, and it's famous for its ceramics collection. And I guess just every day walking into this building around the art, it became evident that I wanted to be a maker and not sort of a historian or a custodian of those objects. So it was just a little bit of a shift, but I still love history. I still love museums.
Yes, there's a lot of history in your work.
Yeah. Yeah, there is.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks.
Let's throw it to Nate, since we'll do a little here, there, here.
All right. Oh man, this is kind of a funny story. I got into ceramics in high school. I was a sophomore, I believe. I took a hand building class, and at that time, I was about ready to drop out of high school, for sure. I was really into skateboarding at the time. All my friends were like seniors when I was a freshman, and I was like, I'm gonna drop out and become a professional skateboarder. So instead, I know, right? It's crazy.
I never heard that.
Yeah, so I took a hand building class, and I sort of liked it. And my art teacher said, come back for a wheel throwing class. I was lucky enough to have, the access to that, and tried that out, and I got really hooked on it. And that's pretty much what kept me in high school. And then just kept going through, went to undergrad at Maine College of Art, and I've been doing it ever since. But yeah, it's one of those things that it has a lot of similarities, I feel like, to like a sport, like if you call it a sport like skateboarding, where it's muscle memory, a lot of it, and there's always more to kind of improve on and explore. So it's kept my interest all these years for sure.
Spinning wheels.
Exactly, and spinning wheels. Exactly. That's a connection to it.
Have you ever tried to combine somehow? I don't see how you could. No.
Oh god. Well, I stopped really skating when I was I think a junior in college, because I broke my arm, and then I was like, I need to pick one or the other. So
yeah,
pick
very injury prone sport. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Excellent. I love learning new things. What about you, Jacob?
I guess the question of like number one, my introduction to ceramics is actually very similar to Nate's, but within the context of like, could I make a living at this? I don't, that's like a bigger, like, that's a different maybe decision or different moment, like inflection point, like, is this possible? And I think that I would be lying if I would say that that is like even settled, you know, like, oh yeah, it's like, you know, you kind of, it's not a second guessing, but it's a wondering, I think. I would also be remiss if I didn't say that show why I'm here right now. It's also part of a collaboration with my partner Layla, that's not here, she's out of the country at the moment, but that so I mean I am one part of the collaboration, but that again, same as Nate, as far as my introduction to ceramics, my aunt started working with clay at an art center like this down in Rockville, Maryland, outside of DC. And said, I think you would be really into this when I was pretty much a freshman in high school. And she nailed me, and she was totally right. And it was like, I think I still have the first piece I threw, and it's not, it's like this moment that it's like, I didn't even finish throwing, I was so excited, where I was like, I'm doing it, and then like, it's like done, and I like actually still have this pieces in my post on, but that started taking classes outside of high school, because it wasn't offered until like you were a junior or senior at the Portland College of Art. So like we take like my metro down to DC to the weekends and do that. And yeah, and it was I come from a kind of a lot of trades people in my family, and that it was always kind of tinkering as a kid, and feeling that with clay was really, and still is, like the first time where there was a volitional transformation. I was willfully kind of like creating something that I was like, this is what I want in my head, and this is what my hands can do. And that it is like, still, I mean, honestly, to this day, it's still incredibly fulfilling. And that, and then it was like, you know, high school, college, and you know, and so on and so forth. Layla, similar actually. Manchester's Craftsman Guild in Pittsburgh is where she started. So outside of high school, did it in high school. We met at Alfred, and haven't always done ceramic work together, but that is kind of the kind of current iteration of the collaboration.
Yeah, great. Well, none of you actually answered the question.
I didn't think we did. I think there was.
But it's fine.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll circle back.
Yeah.
It was actually about why you decided to go into art initially, and you all talked about clay, which is good. They were good answers, but it wasn't exactly the right answer. That's okay. Not that I shouldn't say right. They're all right answers. And the Manchester Craftsman Guild and Everson also makes me think about last week, this conference I went to. Sharif Bey gave a talk, and probably wasn't there when you were there, but he's a professor there now, and he started at Manchester.
He was one of Layla's teachers.
No, his teachers, because he was there as a kid and then eventually taught there as well. So lots of connections in the clay world, as we know. Okay, so now I think we'll change up the order. Maybe Nate can go first and talk about the importance of the Clay Studio residency, and perhaps also because you were most recently in it. So Nate just finished his 5-year term in August. So kind of weird that you're not there anymore. When I walk around the studios, I'm like, and then Nate, oh wait, he's not here. So yeah, and I know it was important to you. I remember talking to you a lot when we first came into the program. So
yeah, can I share my screen? Is that possible?
oh yeah, let me give you the power.
I have some slides that it actually has.
Great.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Wow, that's awesome. Great. Let's see here. Okay.
You're just staring.
All right. Can you see that now?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. Yeah. So when I came into the Clay Studio residency, I was making work sort of like this. Was using commercial red clay I was firing to like a cone 6 oxidation and decorating a lot of things. Pretty much every pot that I made was decorated in some way with brushwork and transparent glazes. And during the residency, I really wanted to move into local clays, using local clays and changing up how I was firing. And, you know, the ability to do that over the course of 5 years, really exploring different clays around the area, it just allowed me to dial in on some specific surfaces that I was really interested in. So, you know, some of the work that I'm making now, just, you know, this is the clay that I'm using. I'm just going to flip through these real quick because it's the clay in the car, but, you know, this is sort of more what I'm making now. It's much more sort of sparse and pared down and reliant on the materials more. So it's been pretty incredible. I mean, to be able to change my work so much in 5 years, it was kind of like a drastic switch. I really changed up my whole process at the clay studio, which was great, and it was a great place to do it. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time here.
Oh, sorry. What was the last thing you said? Say it again.
Oh, I just don't want to take up too much time.
No, not at all. I was just gonna push you a little bit because I feel like you had a goal. The clay studio was kind of a goal of yours, right? Like you came from Maine and you were like, I want to be here for the clay studio.
Definitely, exactly, yeah. I mean, I was looking really to push my work. I was sort of stuck in that work that I was making before, and I thought the clay studio could sort of bring me to the next level, just in terms of my ceramic career and the pots that I was making. Just being surrounded by artists that were all pushing themselves really hard, and, you know, were able to give me feedback, and that was really important to me. And having access to facilities. But it's more so just the people that you're around. I feel like that's why you do a residency.
Oh, Andrea wants to ask you a question.
Hi, Nate.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I'm so fascinated, I've always been fascinated by the way that you've used our local clay here. And I'm wondering, did you know when you came here what kind of local clay you were going to find? And did it work well? Like, did you have to do a lot of research to augment it?
No, when I first came here, I've always had an interest in local clay, but I was living up in Maine, and there's sort of just like one clay and it's terracotta, and you're kind of dealing with that. But I really didn't know what was down here. But once I started doing some research, you can see from this picture, there's just an incredible amount of different colors of clay, and there's a lot of different temperatures of clay, you know, within an hour of here. So having access to that, basically everything went pretty smoothly right from the get-go. I mean, it's beautiful clay, and you can kind of choose what you're trying to do. So, you know, I picked like a really dark clay because I sort of wanted to achieve, sorry, I'm skipping through these, but I kind of wanted to achieve this surface. So it's a really dark clay with a white slip over it. And I was trying to find the clay to suit that surface rather than, you know, taking the clay and figuring out a surface from it. But those are just two ways of working.
And I know you did some research on Google Earth, right? And that's how you found Kaolin, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Like literally with this Google search, you can look at, sorry, I'm skipping so much here, but you know, you can look at old maps and find some clay deposits on the maps, and then just try to find, you know, roughly where that is on Google Maps, and see if you find any ponds or anything that looks like it's kind of like a man-made old mine, and go check it out. And that's a good way to find clay. But yeah, old surveys and maps, definitely a good way to go.
Yeah. Oh, we have another question.
What's the process of when you find clay? What do you do with it?
When you find the clay, what do you do with it?
What's the
How
process?
do you turn it into usable material?
So first, I have some pictures here. First, I put it in the back of my car. I shovel it up, put it in these sandbags, put it in the back of my car, and then I bring it wherever I'm going. Now it's home, and I'll dry it out first, and then put it in a 5-gallon bucket and plunge it with water, and then I'll screen it through like a 40 mesh screen. And you can either add commercial materials to that or just dry that clay out and use it straight. So really the tricky part is kind of testing the clay and figuring out how it fires and not melting it. But a lot of the clays around here will go to cone 10, whatever temperature that you're firing to pretty easily. So.
And the place with those piles is called stancils, and so that material is being brought. That's a mine, right, Nate? Where they're taking that material out of the earth, and for them, it's like excess.
Yeah, this is like junk for them. Like they're looking for sand there mostly. So this is just kind of like the naturally occurring area all around the mine that's sort of eroded over the years, but yeah, they'll just have giant piles of unprocessed clay sitting there that you can pull right up to. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Andrea,
I just wanted to ask about the firing. It seems like you go from electric to like this faster with wood firing. How did that happen?
oh, the question about. Oh, you heard it.
I think, yeah, I heard you. That happened because I saw a pot in the art museum, Philadelphia Art Museum, that I really loved. It was a Korean pot with this sort of blushed surface on it. And yeah, I just really wanted to dial in on this surface when I first got to the clay studio. And it's a reduction fired surface. And in the following years, I just wanted to use these local materials mostly for the glazes and slips. And I feel like the reduction firing and wood firing process just brings out those materials a little bit better for what I'm looking for. So that's really the reason I do it.
Great. Thank you, Nate. And we can talk a little bit more about that current work when I have images of what's in the show downstairs. So we'll do one more loop.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, how about you, Jacob?
Just to make sure I answer the question, is it ask it again so I can be clear about it.
Let's see if I can ask it the same way. What was important to you about your time as a resident artist?
What was important to me as time as a resident artist? Well, I mean, it might be cliche, but it's certainly true as far as the connection with colleagues who you can at times be competitive with, you can be envious of, you can be super supportive of. They support you. It's like they can be your collaborator. You can work together. Like wood firing with Nate is one of my solid memory I have here. Roberta, who was a resident at the time, was there too. I actually went back and did like filming one of the films at that place. The connections with the greater Philadelphia area, the show we did with PMA was incredible. Like that is like going to be one of my like big memories, which is when we got to go into their archives and take objects that we made they worked in response to. I mean, it was awesome. It's like you don't get to do that, did like work with like the Rockport dance like through that connection with you. And like so like it was just like I think that the way that the Play Studio has kind of matured as a kind of like art institution, not necessarily like a ceramic, a place to make ceramic, but an art institution within Philadelphia. Like I got to be a part. I felt like I was a part of that kind of maturing process that is now seen as like a connector amongst creatives in Philadelphia, and I was the beneficiary of that. So that's huge and really not to say priceless, but like I mean when you apply, when one applies to the place, I don't know if it's still the case, but it's like there's a big portion of that is like writing about why you want to come to the Play Studio. It's an important question. and or like why Philadelphia, why now, etc. And I still remember in what I wrote was that like I had applied to be a resident at the Clay Studio like right after undergrad, and then applied again, essentially 5 years later, 6 years later. And it was still like, oh, I thought I knew why I wanted to come. And it's like, actually, this is why I want to come. And it really kind of felt like a place where having gone to grad school, gone to school abroad, like, in a place in my artistic practice where I felt like I was like less trying to like define my space in this kind of large ceramic world, and more like I felt quite comfortable, and I felt like sometimes you have to be comfortable to then take risks. Like that's also like you have to be able to be like, oh, I'm on solid ground. I can kind of take that formative next step from this place of security. And for me, that looked like really kind of diving deeper and kind of establishing this collaboration with Layla. Now doing a lot of like we've made 2 films together with another one of our collaborators. I don't think I would have done any of that work if it wasn't at the Clay Studio. If I didn't feel that I was supported as an artist to kind of like take those risks, almost in the way of like, the films are coming from a place involved with ceramics, but it's an entirely different way of working. And I think to certainly your credit, Jay-Z, that like that was never like, there's never like why, like there's never like why, like it was just kind of like, okay, like showing what you got, like next, like I want to, it was the encouragement happens through the kind of like the constant like belief in what the artists are doing here, and not a questioning of them, which is like what happens in grad school and undergrad and blah blah, so definitely felt like I hit at the right time, and finding a place where in Philadelphia at large that like very much feels like home now. Yeah, all thanks to the Place to go.
That's great. I think that's a really good point, that idea of being comfortable to allow you to kind of branch out is important, because, and that's why even though the residency is now 3 years instead of 5 years, it's still long enough that you don't have to start thinking about where you're going to go the minute you get here.
Yep.
It happens with shorter residencies where you're just like hustling to try to get one project done and then figure out the next. Okay, Andrea, what was important about your time as a resident artist?
I definitely have similar feelings as Jacob. For me, testing glazes was really important. That was part of my application, wanting to come in. And I don't know if any of you have tried to set up your home studio, but it's a humongous expense. And even just like having small amounts of glaze material and being able to store that was such a big obstacle. And I tried having another profit organization make them for me, and that ended up being a disaster. It was just hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. And then of course the community, I think that most of us have experienced in other points in our careers. We miss it. And Philly is a large, thriving arts community, and it's hard here. I mean, it's wonderful and it's hard. And the Clay Studio, I was here in Philly for a couple of years before I was able to be a resident, and it was really, really difficult to not have the financial and the institutional support. So I'm super grateful for that. And then just the sort of the camaraderie, right? So important. But I talked about this at our reception, but I had this other thing that I'm really trying to be very open about. If anybody listening to this recording ever wants to talk about it, but I decided to become a mother while I was an artist in residence. And so that was another layer, and the Clay Studio was a big part of me feeling that I could do that, and that I had a support network here. And so I think there's been 3 of us now in the time since I've been part of the program that have had children, like actually had the children, which I think is a huge component of being an artist, is the physical strain. Is that an underestimation of what happens of having, not just caring for a child, but actually have like bearing the child. while you're an artist. And ceramics physical and chemical based, and there's so many what ifs, and there's so little conversation about it. And I do want to continue to have that conversation with organizations here in Philly and outside of Philly about how we can support women who want to have families and want to bear children, and maybe offer daycare stipends for artists at some point. Like, I'd love to be able to just advocate for that for future folks. Yeah.
Wholeheartedly agree with all of that. Yeah, it's important to have support and have people who have gone through it that you. Sorry. Well, thanks. Okay, so now we're gonna look at the work that's in this show downstairs. And I know how to do this. It's exciting. Okay, so there are it's that thing with it. Hold on one second. I have to move the people over. Because then you can't move them anymore. Okay. There we go. Okay, well, so I put Nate's in first because I didn't have a plan, but I think I'm gonna go to Jacob because he's the one who hasn't gone first yet. So let's just scroll all the way. Oh, you get to see everything. So would you like to tell us the title of your film, Jacob?
Rorschach.
And what does that mean?
Means final screen.
Because they have a word for everything.
Have you ever heard? I mean, yes, a word. So the show is, if you were to go to the space, it is 8 objects, very much reading a sculpture on pedestals that we made. One of the objects is essentially on the floor. He's hanging on the wall. And this is the first time we were doing kind of sculptural objects. I think that, or rather I should say, making sculpture. I think it's a way, I'm making that distinction because it feels like a different approach than making functional objects, while simultaneously many of the objects are functional. It feels like an important distinction to make. It certainly was for us, Willever and I, when we were making that. And the objects kind of all live within a kind of domestic space, so bookends, vases, ashtrays, planters, teapots. So it all has the functional domestic vernacular kind of language all in it and using it. So certainly we are trying to kind of twist it both, I think, as to what could be these things. So like asking that question, mashing up things. So we have a vase, chia pet, ashtray combined as an object. Sometimes kind of seeking maybe a little something that's a bit disgusting or a bit repulsive at first, but still is aesthetically beautiful. Like it's still, you're still reacting positively to it when you're seeing it, when you're in that space. Doesn't matter what we're kind of working on or working with, we really kind of drive towards a kind of sensual experience. Certainly something like of the senses, not necessarily like erotic per se, but objects that have like high degrees of tactility. We have a chocolate bookend, chocolate fondue fountain bookend that people were compelled to eat from during the opening. So like certainly there's taste, but also that it smells that kind of saccharine, kind of sweet of the liquid chocolate. dice, vibrating dice table, certainly when that's on, it like kind of exudes its own ness, its own kind of like being. It's almost feels like alive when it's on. It's very dramatic. And then there's beyond the sensuality, beyond the kind of clash or the amalgamation of domestic objects, there's also this other undercurrent of maybe like a vanitas or memento mori, a little bit of a inevitability of death kind of seeping in there. I think making this work in particular at this point, maybe echoing my initial comments as far as things just going to shit around us, felt like it feels a nice departure for us to move away from functional objects that are sold on Instagram to kind of ultimately questioning like the made object, the thing to be sold, a thing that is to be owned. So that's a lot of me talking, but that's what we would hope for you to be experiencing in the show. All of the above in some regards.
Thank you.
Yep.
I thought maybe I was searching for images of
Yeah, you were searching. What were you looking for?
I was looking for pictures of the installation because you started talking about what it looked like when you walked in, and then I don't have any in the PowerPoint. So
like the idea of putting something with something else, like the idea of like the vase, this sort of thing. So that is interesting. I would say it's an interesting outfit. Yes, that's the ashtray in the bottom, and it's a vase, and it's kind of like chia pet. And if you go to the clock real quick, also, so that clock, and I'll answer your question, but just because I like that image showing it, is that clock is a John Gill bowl. You actually can see John Gill, 1993. So that's an actual John Gill bowl that it's embedded in concrete, and like we drilled through and put this kind of clock on it. And now if you go to the vase, what I've always liked about John Gill, wasn't a professor of mine, though I never took class with him. He didn't advise me, but did with Layla. We met at Oxford, professor there. That a particular glazing technique of that I think of this, he may not say it this way, but I always think of this glazing technique where it's like creating shapes, glazed shapes that are also the shape of the thing that you are glazing. So it's like the idea that like you would glaze like a vase shape, like that would be a color of one of his palettes on it. And so it really was like surface form, that kind of like vibration. So nice with like the chia referencing the whole, referencing the top, like that kind of like circle was, I think, something we were thinking through as far as that process of combining stuff. Literally a list of like things we wanted in the show, and it was like connecting dots. I mean, there was like that, like we have it, and some things like didn't work. Some things it's the paradox of collaboration, which is like, I think something's brilliant and she thinks it's horrible. It's like, so there was some editing for sure. I think that one of the big editing was actually, took a long time to figure out the teapot. Like I wanted a teapot in the show. Layla wasn't, actually that's my York, go to the black stone. Yeah, so that's the teapot. So teapot with it's a cast stone, big cast stone with a hose coming out of it, hose being the spout with a cast of my toe as the lid. And figuring out what that shape should be was a big part of that question. I think went through a lot of sketching, different iterations to figure out, like, I wanted something to be large, and through our conversations, like finding out what it could be, what could be the vessel, what could hold the idea of teapot, and coming across like feeling like the stone would be kind of the best bet with it. What was some other tricky ones? Yeah, the chocolate fountain bookend. That kind of was just like had to be made. I mean, like that was just, I don't know if it could have been anything else, but I think that there was an interesting conversation both through formally what that looks like. We were worried it was going to look like a toilet, And, like, that's not the most kind of like evocative, like formally, like without minus the glaze, like it's like that, like this total one could read toilet there. But though, like the back end of it, the back side of it, that's where the books are pressing, also has a particular like headstone, which like the conversations around form, all of those kind of existed, I think, on pencil and paper. And then once that is kind of worked out, then we move to making things out of clay. And thankfully, this is certainly, I think with the exception of like the cast stone for the teapot, everything kind of worked pretty well. Like the first go, the teapot was almost didn't make it into the show simply because we could not kind of like figure out how to, something was wrong with how we were firing it, that it kept splitting in this like really strange way that like it just was like, I don't know why this is happening, and then like eventually figured it out.
So we have, I think we're gonna hold the question for the end because we want to make sure we're gonna, but please remember your questions. And I see there are a lot of hands up, which is exciting.
Yeah.
But Andrea, I'm gonna ask you to go next. And talk about, your matter in a floating world and the title and how that reflects the work.
Not to not answer your question, but it's funny because Jacob's work makes me think about speculative design, and having that experience of going in stacks was like, I'd love to talk to you more about how influential that was, especially about how you made the piece that you made. But this piece sort of, my brain just connects seemingly random things, but this piece came out of that sort of similar, not intentionally necessarily, but influence of looking at those historical and contemporary objects and thinking about design and the like historical design and craft and art, they weren't always such separate things that I feel like maybe they are now, even though that's still shifting quite a bit. But this is an essential oil holder, and so we were able to look at these potpourri boats that were just these incredibly extravagant objects in the stacks. And so this was my version of that. And so this is just a shadow of a plant, and that's what all of my work was made from. And so the original title of the show was about the categorization of those things. I might have just had a Boston accent there for a second, but just the notion of what a non-material thing is. And there's a philosopher named Roberto Cassetti who's written about minor entities. And so that was my intentional title of the show. And so I was thinking about how that might be also interpreted in terms of domestic spaces. And so these very seemingly unrelated things sort of merging in my brain. And so all the work are shadows that I have wanted to objectify, is sort of a misleading word, but bring into material, I suppose. And so that's where the actual title that we ended up going with comes into place, which is also probably another hour of me trying to unpack, because it is a book by an architect, and it also talks about a reference to Edo period Japanese ways of thinking, aesthetics, and historical references. But I do think of my work as being either engineered or architectural, and so yeah, it's very hard for me to give a summary of that. But there is information on the website. Yeah. So this is a chandelier. It's funny because they look decorative and they look rococo, and I never start off with that intention. But desire factors in, and an impulse to make this thing and bring it into existence comes into play, and somehow that links into how humans decorate, or a lot of us decorate, and so that can't be denied, that look. But they are meant to be open-ended objects. I definitely have my own personal narratives when I make them, but I do hope that folks will bring their own stories. And I do think even just in the last 5 years, we've had historical events that have changed and reframed the way I think about my work and some of the objects I've made. And so that was also one of the reasons for the shift to title. This piece, the turquoise piece was made for, made 5 pieces for the Philadelphia airport right after my daughter was born, and that was one of them. It's called Jardiniere. It's the shadow of a fig tree. It's supposed to have an ombre, like a reverse ombre there, which means shadow in French. So it's like the shadow of a shadow with shaded glazing. And so that redundancy becomes really interesting for me, and just the sort of abnormal or aberration of nature that these things are. So yeah.
I don't know if you said out loud today the idea that they're tracings, drawings taken from the shadows of your plants. Did you say that? Just so people understand that part of it, and then transformed like several times. You know that.
Yeah. Really process based.
And then, you know, connected so beautifully with these philosophical concepts and texts that you're, you know, absorbing. And you can really, I think, I feel when I walk into the space that you can really feel that, you know, you're thinking about these things as you're also, not that I need to explain your process for you, but, you know, creating coil built slabs, which is like this kind of meditative process, I imagine, or maybe not, maybe it's frenetic. So it's, and I love you touched on this today, and to sort of put a finer point, not a finer point, another emphasis on the idea that you're taking a shadow, which is an unthing, and making it into this very physical, very
Gravity
chunky is not really an eloquent word, and I'm trying to think of a more eloquent word, but like
robust.
There we go. So that it has this very strong physical presence is really beautiful. So thank you. And they're beautiful objects. Okay, so we're holding questions, and we're gonna go back to Nate, and you can talk to us about your process, Nate, and then also in the course of your comments, the title of your show, which is Softening. So if you want to start with that or end with it as you desire.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so for this show, I know I wanted to make a series of larger jars, and in the past probably couple years, I've been kind of steering away from the thrown surface, whether that's cutting into the clay or literally just scraping the clay and trying to soften the form. So it's more of a, you have less tension from the throwing. And when I try to describe that, it might not make sense, but when you have a thrown object, it's got all this torque from the throwing. And for me, that comes across as it usually being a sort of like tight, very controlled object. And being a wheel thrower, that just kind of naturally happens over the years of working on the wheel. And I'm trying to like literally erase that with these pieces by scraping them down and giving them more of a hand belt sort of look to the surface. And the whole feeling of the pot, like I'll actually sort of like dent slightly the form and make it sort of softer is really what the look that I'm going for. And this pot in particular is just a really thin layer of the local clay and wood ash from my fireplace mixed together. And that forms sort of a glaze. It's sort of half a slip, half a glaze, but it's a very sort of matte surface that highlights the whatever you do to the form, whether it's a stiff form or a really soft form. And I brought, hopefully people can see this on Zoom, but I brought some pots out from my collection. My mom got this one at an antique store. So these forms, I'm really looking at old sort of early American pots, Korean pots, some Japanese pots, but they're sort of like a mixture of everything. It's not like I'm referencing one thing in particular. But these early American pots are just amazing. I know you're probably stripping the screen there. Hopefully. Here's one. Here's a real old pot that has the spots that are on a lot of my pots. This pot's probably from the late 1700s. But yeah, these really just beautiful old soft forms. I'm trying to sort of reference some of those. But in terms of the process, most of the pots in the show have that surface called Gohunde, which is just a white slip over that dark local clay. And depending on how thick or thin the slip is and how thick or thin the clear glaze is, you get a ton of surface variation. So really there's only 2 layers there, but you know, you get this incredible depth, and the glazed pinholing is what causes these little spots to form with an orange halo around them. And I can talk more about that later if you have a question about that. But yeah, it's I think one of my favorite pots in the show is that first slide that you have. And I think that pot had kind of shows the example of the soft form and that surface sort of combining together the best. But
That's great.
yeah.
Thank you. It was really lovely to talk with you before the show about, you know, what was going to be in the show, and then once we kind of came to that idea that it was, you know, a handful of really big, beautiful pots without this, which I hope kind of also relieved the tension of getting ready for an exhibition. And that was kind of, you know, part of that process of saying like, okay, well, you know, I have this other show that I'm doing, there's some other stuff, and of course like teaching and everything, and how can we really honor the last moment of your residency? And I remember saying like, well, what if we just do like 5 big pots? And you're like, okay, like you took a breath, like I can do 5 big pots. Yeah, that's great.
Definitely.
And then, yeah, I don't think I made that connection until just now that we were then right before the show opened, we were like, okay, what's the title? What are we going to talk about in the text? And you brought up that idea of, you know, relieving the tension. There was another word you used, dissipating the tension. No, that's not it either. You used a really good word that I can't remember right now. And we were digging into that idea of the thrown lines are kind of related to this idea of perfection and machine made, and the tension of the physics, the tension of the clay itself is part of that idea, and that releasing it was a way to give your viewer the opportunity also to kind of take a deep breath and release the tension, disrupt the tension. That's what you wanted to do, disrupt.
There you go. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, for me, I mean, it's all about things that I want to live with, like in my personal home. You know, I don't really necessarily want to be surrounded by super mechanical objects all the time. It just isn't really my thing. I just love sort of natural, kind of softer objects that just blend into, you know, where I'm living, or, you know, my life really. So that's usually what I'm sort of trying to create, something that's not gonna, you know, slap you in the face, but just something really quiet and that you can live with.
Yeah, that's lovely. And the fact that what we surround ourselves with does matter. It affects our emotional state and our psyche, and also just sitting here thinking about the work you all make separately definitely reflects, I think, that idea too, like what you want to surround yourself with, different forms of beauty, all beautiful things, but kind of different takes on that, and those reflect your personalities, which is pretty special that I get to see that. And, you know, just to respond a bit to the fact that you all gained something from being residents, I just want to say how much I gained from working with you and being part of that community that supports you. So thank you for being artists in the world and sharing your lives with the clay studio.
That's glorious.
Yeah.
I know people have questions, so does anyone want, it's 2:00, but we always, we can go over for a few minutes, as long as people have 5 more minutes. So who has a question that they want to ask? Ellen.
I was curious about, you said paradox, but your work is really fun.
Good,
I thought it was hilarious.
awesome. That's
I was really struck by the Polaroid on the pedestal and the plant. And then the frame of the house. And it was just something so brilliant. And
very sweet.
no, I mean it.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, just from this conversation with Jen, how do you see your work going forward? What will is that your trajectory to merge with just the way you see the world?
So
Amazing.
number one, I think you're great. And but number two, as I think I started off saying that for Layla and I, doing this sculptural show is new. So and it was interesting. We get the other thing about nice thing about collaboration, you really do get to talk a lot. So in our conversations, the thing that came up was as the show kind of was reaching its final stages and things are coming out of the kiln and we're feeling good about things and feeling good about the things that aren't in the show because it feels nice to edit, that this show for us really feels like the beginning of something, and rather than like a culmination, like let's just put a stamp on it and be done, which other shows we've done previously have been like, this is the culmination, done, excited to move on to the next thing. So, I mean, we may just stay working in this way, that the list that we talked about, there's a lot of things that didn't get put into the show. That being said, I mentioned briefly that we make these films. These films are a earnest attempt at making a film that on the conclusion of you watching it, you would have learned how to throw on the potter's wheel. Like you would have, that would be transmitted into your brain and body, and you'd be able to sit at the potter's wheel and be able to make pots. That's the earnest ambition of those films. While we understand it's an impossible kind of conceit, there's a lot of humor in those also. And I think that humor that you're speaking about, that is something that we, between the two of us, and I think in our individual work, more so for Layla than myself, but that's an important aspect, and I'm really glad that you had that experience there.
Well, it's because all the show. So much time.
That the just very quickly, the anecdotal thing about the tombstone is that that's my grandfather's tombstone.
It is not.
It's my grandfather's tombstone, and it when so we're Jewish, or I'm Jewish, Layla's not, going to the unveiling, which happens like a year later. That on the way down there, we went to a quarry with a friend of ours just to swim, and I had written in with stones the word help, as if being on a deserted island, and went there to the unveiling, and my uncle was like, "Oh, like there's a funny thing. I did not know that this help was on the back of this tombstone until the unveiling." And apparently he had written it. They going through like his papers, he was like on boards and things. He would just write help on all of his notes, like "Get me the hell out of here," just like somebody save me. And so that ended up being put on the back of his tombstone.
Good story. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you talk about the color in your work? There are different like colors, the colors. How do you choose the color? How do you choose the paint?
So lots of glaze testing. The red is a low temperature red commercial glaze. It most likely has cadmium and selenium in it. Just a little tip, if you want to get really bright reds, cone 04 is too hot. It burns out. You need to test, and it's very sensitive kiln to kiln. I had a little bit of a learning curve. Jennifer might remember this. A piece that was made that was disrupted by a show for COVID. I made the piece here. Well, I didn't make it here. I made it in Old City, and then I fired it at my home studio. And so shifting from kiln to kiln, the kiln was off by at least a cone. So like I've been testing like crazy to get ready for the show. So like constant glaze tests. And I mean, ceramics is just always kicking my butt. I mean, when I think it's gonna be like easy, it always is a way of being in control. So the red is a commercial glaze by Spectrum, and I think there's a lot of really incredible commercial glazes available now. The turquoise is a base that I was using from Bruce Daynard, who's now the head of ceramics at Sugar Maples in New York. It's his base that I got when I worked with him at Peters Valley School of Craft, and it's copper and rutile. I think when I make my glazes, they always end up having copper and rutile in them. So I didn't actually intend to make the glazes sort of that Christmas color thing that's happening in there.
Really, that did not occur.
That's good, because I was really nervous about that in my studio when I was looking at test tiles, that there was this like bluey green dominating with this bright red. But I suppose if I can step back for a moment, my pieces, I lived with the drawings in my studio for a while, and I think Jennifer's right when she says that we kind of surround ourselves with the work that we make, and I do that quite intentionally. And then the forms kind of emerge a story, like they are projective in that sense. And so the glaze is kind of just kind of happens. It's not like a really like decisive moment, although my husband who is listening on this call does actually give me quite a bit of advice from time to time, because he's trained as a painter. So thanks, Joe. And a lot of the cone 6 glazes, the turquoises and the greens that are in the show, are microcrystalline glazes. And so they have a really slow cool to help the surface develop. And that was another thing that ceramics kicked me in the butt for a long time, was having like moving from electric kilns at a place like Alfred, where Jacob and I went to school together. And then being in a space where the electric kilns are like, they're good, but they're not like Frederickson Alfred style electric kilns, and having to adjust the firing to just sort of replicate the effects that you were getting like that. I think that took me like 4 or 5 years to figure out that it was the cooling and not the chemistry that had altered my glazes. I had talked to a friend about the water, and I thought maybe, you know, the mines were being mined differently, different veins of whatever materials were changing. So so the glazes are always like something that I've tried so many times to stop using glazes. But ultimately I always come back to it, and I think it's why I make these things out of clay, that and the fact that the glaze bushes, because I want to be able to glaze them.
So I was just wondering, at what stage do you choose the color? Is it always in your mind and stuff in this?
No, there are some pieces that aren't in the show that were going to be completely different colors, and political events happened, and I completely rethought the colors because history reframed how I was thinking about them. Yeah. I think the red, I would say, I don't know if anybody else has picked up on it, but there is a real tension between like a sort of bluish green and a red in the show. And I'm not trying to make work about socio-political events, but the red really came about, you know, what, 6 years ago now? I couldn't shake it. Yeah, because you know that saying, if you can't make it good, make it red. I mean, that thought has entered my mind a number of times, like maybe we just need to make it better.
They're beautiful. Okay, we're sort of out of time, but I know Raymond had a question, and does anyone really quick question?
Yeah, that question was good. I was wondering if you could speak to what part that clay as a material is. Because of that 29, is this a piece of clay or is this material? And is this an argument? And I love the way you work.
I have 2-part thing. One of them goes back to the early answer of why I got into clay. Like,
Can you repeat the question?
the question. Okay.
No, you.
The question was, if I can say, is basically, was it was it why clay or what the role of clay has in the work? As a material, yes. Speaking for myself, that I was at a lecture at Alfred when I was an undergrad, and Jim Melcher, who's one of my, at the time, and still in many ways is like a very touchstone for me as an artist, somebody who I like to work. And then in what was said, basically he had like a, I don't know if you were there for this, but he had like a tube and he like held it up, and he was basically like a central piece of his talk was that my takeaway was that potters essentially become infected by the wheel, right? It's like once you are in, Nate, I don't know, it's like once it's in you, it's like how you think about the world. And so like, yeah, I could be working with other materials, but I think, again, earnestly, at this point, I would always be thinking about other materials as a potter would think about them. And I don't like, and that can be, even for me, it's like, feels weird to say out loud, but it's like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of honesty there for me. Like, it's how I think about the world, right? It's just in there. Now, in the show downstairs, we made a concerted effort to have porcelain, have cast porcelain, have terracotta, have stoneware, have it's actually like a library of different ceramic materials and processes down there. Almost every piece is a different technique or different material. Some things are only even tangentially ceramics, and I'm thinking about the ashtray foam piece, where the only ceramic piece in there is an ashtray that we bought and we didn't even make. So I think that to me, it's like there's still to the humor side of it, there's still a lot of like humor and playfulness in it, specifically with clay and specifically for me, because I can't help myself, because this is just what I know now. And even though there is other materials present in that show and in work that we make, I still think it comes from a ceramic sensibility and knowledge base.
Once a potter, always a potter.
Stuff.
Love it.
I like it.
Okay, well, thanks for sticking with us for a little extra time. Thank you all for coming virtually and in person. Thank you to the 3 artists. See you later,
Thank you.
Nate.
See ya. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.